Welcome to another week of daily devotionals as part of our Growing Disciples program, where we're reading through the whole Bible in a year at whatever level or depth suits you. In the month of October, we've been focusing on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In a sense, we're at the high point of the entire biblical narrative, which is why we've slowed right down to give ourselves an opportunity to be impacted by the gospel all over again. This week, our daily devotionals are all about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. While there's so much that we could say, our priority here is actually going to be to sit with the narrative of the text, to observe and to ponder these original documents which God has inspired and preserved for our good and for our encouragement in following after the Lord Jesus. And so today we turn to Luke's Gospel. There's been a Sabbath day's silence. Of course, there's lots of creative theories around the timing of the Passover festival and the Sabbath, but one thing that's universally agreed is that Jesus' resurrection occurs on the day immediately after the Sabbath. It was the day of rest, that Sabbath, when everything stopped. And so now this early morning would have felt a bit like a Monday morning to us, up early on a back to work kind of day. And although in the midst of the great festival, perhaps not everyone was heading back to work immediately. But for some of the women in Jesus' group of followers, they had some very important work to do. We pick up the narrative in Luke 24, beginning at verse 1. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Now, Luke doesn't make much of the stone covering the entrance to the tomb, but Matthew's Gospel does. That's where we learn about the Roman soldiers who had been charged with guarding the tomb and about this large stone that had been rolled across the entrance and sealed with the governor's seal, all to prevent the possibility that Jesus' body could be tampered with in any way. The tomb was locked down and secured outside. But no one expected an inside job, that Jesus would come out from the inside. But even then, there's mystery, because Matthew tells us that it was an angel who actually rolled the stone out of the way in order to reveal an already empty tomb. But for the women early on that Sunday morning, this, removed a significant barrier to completing the task of properly embalming Jesus' body for a traditional Jewish burial. So back in verse 2, they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly, two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. And quite naturally, the women quickly returned to the gathering of Jesus' followers, who were perhaps slowly rousing themselves from sleep on that Sunday morning. Verse 9, when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Now, as we ponder Luke's account of that resurrection morning, we can't help seeing this as the reporting of the extraordinary within the ordinary. Something has happened. Something extraordinary has happened. But as yet, it's not at all clear exactly what has happened and what it means. early on a back-to-working day, even in the midst of the disciples' grief. The apostles are told, but they don't believe the women. Was it because they were women that they were not believed? Well, I suspect that Jesus' practice of including women and elevating women as full disciples would have mitigated against that. And quite remarkably, Jesus arranged things so that it was the women that were the first witnesses of his resurrection. They were the first to announce his resurrection, another demonstration of their credibility and value as Jesus' disciples. Now, I think that the apostles did not believe the women simply because what they had to say just made no sense, exactly as the text suggests. In the very plain sense of the word, a resurrection from the dead was unprecedented. That is, something like this had never happened before, ever. If I tried to convince you that I had time travelled back to 1955 and had just returned, I don't think many people would initially believe me. Why? Because time travel like that has never actually happened before. And in a far, far greater and more astonishing circumstance, it's no wonder the women were disbelieved. How could the tomb be empty? Apart from grave robbers beating up the Roman guards, breaking the governor's seal and rolling the stone away, how could this happen? Besides that, ancient grave robbers were not at all interested in the body as such. They were interested in any wealth or anything of value that was buried along with the deceased. The body probably would have been left behind. And so in Jesus' case, the body of a crucified criminal held no promise at all for any self-respecting grave robber. Anyway, I don't think Peter's thinking that logically at the time. He simply hears the report from the women and he believes them enough to run to the tomb to verify the facts. He confirms that it was indeed empty. Now, Luke then records some of Peter's puzzling observations, strips of linen lying on the side. That's it, the tomb's empty. And so what is to be made of it, this empty tomb, early on this back-to-work Sunday morning? The only interpretation that is given is what is said by the angels to the women at the empty tomb. First of all, the fact he's not here, he has risen. Even without the confirmation of actually seeing Jesus fully human again, body and soul, the women are told he is resurrected, not resuscitated, not revived, but dead, buried, and resurrected, risen. But the angels remind Jesus' disciples that, hey, this isn't new. Jesus had on many occasions told his disciples plainly he must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, whether Gentiles or Jews was meant, not really relevant. He must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again. In Jesus' teaching, this was always a must, a necessity. It must happen in this way in order to fulfill God's plan and purpose. Jesus had prepared his disciples for an unprecedented event as best as possible, and now they needed to catch up, to come to terms with it. The tomb was empty. The angel explained this, saying that he had risen, just as he said. And the reason that this was all so hard to fathom was that for any Jew well versed in the Old Testament, the resurrection of the dead was something that only happened on Judgment Day, when all things had arrived at the great consummation at the end of time. But here was Jesus' resurrection, the most extraordinary news, being declared in the midst of the ordinary day. Clearly, Judgment Day had not yet arrived on this sleepy back-to-work morning in Jerusalem. It was another ordinary working day like any other. But somehow, according to the angel, resurrection has burst into the ordinary everyday. It wasn't the universal resurrection of the dead, but Jesus has burst forth from death, apparently ahead of time, out of time. Death's power is broken now and forever, but in the middle of time instead of at the end of time. As for us, as we reflect back on this event, we have so much more to go on, the benefit of so much hindsight. But I wonder if right now we are ready for God's resurrection power to burst into our ordinary back-to-work day. We're so used to the finality of death. People are born and then they die. Sadly, desperately, that's really all we know. It's what we expect. But against all expectations, on this day, God continues to bring life out of death. The spiritually dead can be transformed by Jesus. So on this day, God continues to surprise and delight his disciples because death's grip on humanity has been broken. Are you ready for that? Perhaps now you might pray about that today.